My name is Margaret, and I'm 68 years old. I've spent most of my life working double shifts, raising a boy who was supposed to be my forever reason to smile. When my husband walked out 3 decades ago, it was just me and Daniel. I remember those nights when he'd wake up crying because the other kids had fathers to play catch with. I'd wipe his tears and promise him that I'd make up for everything he lacked. I worked at the diner during the day and cleaned offices. At night, every penny I saved went into his schooling, his dreams, his future. I used to tell people I didn't need anyone. I had my son. He was my beginning and my end. People called me foolish for loving that much, but I called it motherhood. I thought love could never betray me, but I was wrong, because one quiet Sunday morning, as I sat with my tea scrolling through Facebook, that illusion shattered with one single photo. It was just an ordinary post someone had tagged him in a set of pictures. I clicked without thinking, expecting maybe a work event or a reunion. The first image loaded slowly, my old internet wheezing along, and there he was, Daniel, in a navy blue suit, smiling like he'd never known a day of hardship. And beside him, a woman in a white gown. My eyes couldn't comprehend what they were seeing. I leaned closer, squinting, hoping I was mistaken, but the caption confirmed it. Congratulations to the newlyweds, Daniel and Sophie. Newlyweds. My throat closed up. I stared at that word until it lost meaning. My son, married. Married without telling me. Married without me there to hold his hand, to fix his tie, to kiss his cheek. My fingers went cold around the phone. It felt like someone had scooped my heart out and replaced it with silence. I don't remember setting the phone down. One moment, I was staring at their smiling faces. The next, I was on the kitchen floor. The sound of my breathing filled the room, ragged and uneven. My tea had spilled, creeping across the tiles like a shadow. I thought about every birthday cake, every late bill paid so he could go on school trips, every time I skipped a new coat so he could have decent shoes. And now he stood there, arm around a woman I'd never met, while strangers celebrated what should have been the happiest day of my life too. I whispered his name over and over, as if he might hear me through the walls, through the distance, through the betrayal. But the house stayed silent, like it was grieving with me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept going back to his profile, scrolling through every photo. There was the ceremony, white chairs, flowers, friends, and family. Her family, not mine. I wasn't even mentioned in the captions. It was as if I didn't exist. One picture caught my breath, Daniel dancing with her mother, smiling like that woman had raised him. I stared at it until my eyes stung. Then came the flood of comments. So beautiful. You two are perfect. Your mom must be so proud. I wanted to type something, anything, to remind the world I was still here, that I was his mother, but my fingers froze. What could I say? That my son had erased me? That love can rot quietly under the surface until one day it's gone? I finally called him the next morning. My voice shook so much I barely recognized it. Danny, I said when he picked up. Silence on the other end. Mom, he said, like he hadn't expected me to find out. You got married, I whispered. There was another pause, the kind that cuts. Then a sigh. Yeah, Mom. It just kind of happened fast. We didn't want to make a big deal. My heart pounded. A big deal? I'm your mother. He groaned quietly, as if my pain was inconvenient. Mom, please don't start. It was small, okay? We just wanted to keep it simple. I wanted to scream, but all that came out was, you didn't even tell me. His voice hardened. I knew you'd make it dramatic. That was when I realized something had shifted. My son wasn't the boy I'd raised. He sounded like a stranger. Every word he spoke felt like a slap. I didn't want to deal with your guilt trips, he said flatly. You'd have found something to criticize anyway. I stood in my kitchen, gripping the counter for balance. Criticize? I choked out. Daniel, I gave you everything. His wife's voice echoed faintly in the background. I recognized her laugh from the wedding video clips. Tell her we'll visit later, she said, casual, almost bored. He didn't even lower his voice when he said, we'll see. That's when I knew I had been replaced, not just forgotten, but replaced. The days that followed felt like years. The betrayal sat inside me like a heavy stone. People in town started to whisper they'd seen the photos too. "Did you know Margaret?" one of my old coworkers asked softly. I just smiled, pretending I'd been invited, pretending my heart wasn't in pieces. I stopped going out much. The house felt emptier than ever, even though it was filled with memories. Every photo on the wall felt like a lie. One afternoon, while dusting the shelves, I found the deed papers, the house where Daniel and Sophie now lived. My name, clear as day, on every page. I'd bought it for him 5 years ago when he struggled after college. He'd promised he'd pay me back someday. That day never came, but the papers reminded me of something I had forgotten. I still had power. That night, I sat with the papers spread out before me like old ghosts. My hands trembled, not with anger, but with something colder, resolve. I remembered the sacrifices I'd made to secure that property. I'd worked 2 extra years past retirement, my back aching every night, just to give him a home. I never wanted repayment. All I'd wanted was gratitude, a visit, a phone call, a simple thank you. Instead, he'd built a life on my silence. And maybe that was my mistake. I'd let love blind me into servitude. I reached for my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. My lawyer, Mr. Bennett. When he answered, I simply said, "I need to discuss the house deed." He invited me to his office the next morning. I arrived early, clutching the folder to my chest. He looked surprised to see me. It had been a decade since we'd last spoken. "Margaret," he said kindly, "what brings you in?" I sat across from him and unfolded the papers. "I want to sell this property," I said. His eyebrows lifted. "The one your son lives in?" I nodded. He hesitated. "You sure you want to do that?" I met his gaze, steady. "I've spent my whole life giving, Mr. Bennett. I think it's time I took something back." He studied me for a moment, then smiled faintly. "Then let's get started." The process took 2 weeks. I told no one. Each signature felt like shedding a layer of pain. I'd sit by the window every evening, watching the sun dip low and thinking about how I'd let myself disappear in the name of love. I wasn't selling out of vengeance, I told myself. I was reclaiming my dignity. When the sale finalized, Mr. Bennett called me. "It's done, Margaret. Funds are in your account." I thanked him and sat in silence for a long time. Then, with trembling hands, I wrote a short message to my son. "Daniel, you and your wife will need to vacate the house within 30 days. The property has been sold." I stared at the text before hitting send. My heart pounded, not from fear this time, but from freedom. The response came faster than I expected. Barely 10 minutes had passed before my phone began to ring, his name flashing on the screen over and over again. I stared at it, my pulse thundering in my ears, but I didn't pick up. After the 5th missed call, a message arrived. "What do you mean the house is sold?" Another followed. "You can't do this, Mom." I let them sit there, glowing on the screen like tiny acts of desperation. For years, I had dropped everything the second he needed me. Now, for the first time, I did nothing. Later that night, there was pounding on my door. When I opened it, Daniel stood there, his eyes wild. "Tell me this is a joke," he said. "You wouldn't sell our house." His words made me laugh, bitter, humorless. "Our house?" I repeated softly. "I didn't know I lived there, Daniel." He froze. "That's not what I meant." But it was too late. I saw it in his eyes, the guilt, the arrogance, the dawning realization that he'd underestimated me. He followed me into the living room, pacing like a trapped animal. "Sophie's gonna freak out," he muttered. "We just redecorated." I cut him off. "You mean she redecorated the house I paid for?" My voice came out sharper than I intended, but I didn't pull it back. "Mom, you don't understand," he said, running a hand through his hair. "We were going to tell you. It all happened fast." I sat down slowly, my hands folded in my lap. "You didn't want to tell me because you were ashamed, or maybe because you didn't think I mattered anymore." His silence said everything. I felt a strange calm wash over me, not anger anymore, but a kind of release. You made your choices, I said quietly. Now I'm making mine. He stared at me like he didn't recognize who I was. Maybe he didn't. Maybe I'd been too small, too forgiving, for too long. When he left that night, he didn't slam the door, didn't shout, just looked at me one last time with something between fear and disbelief. I watched his car disappear down the road and stood there for a long while, the night air cool on my face. Inside, the phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Sophie. How could you do this to your own son? You're ruining his life. I stared at it, fingers hovering over the screen. I almost replied, almost tried to explain that I'd spent a lifetime putting his life above mine. But then I realized she'd never understand. She hadn't seen the nights, stayed awake worrying about bills, hadn't heard the sound of Daniel crying when his father left. So instead of replying, I deleted her message and turned off my phone. Some people aren't worth explanations. The next few days were quiet, unnervingly quiet. But quiet doesn't last in a small town. By the end of the week, whispers started spreading. People I'd known for decades looked at me differently, some with pity, others with a kind of awe. Did you really sell the house? A woman at the grocery store asked, her voice half curious, half scandalized. I just smiled. Yes, I said simply, and moved on. At home, I'd sit by the window and watch the sunset, wondering when exactly love had turned into obligation. I'd raised my son to stand tall, but somewhere along the line, he'd learned to look down on me. And maybe that was my fault too. I'd built him a world so soft, he never learned what gratitude felt like. Now, life was teaching him a lesson I never could. The real storm hit when Sophie's parents called me. Their tone was polite but laced with venom. Margaret, her mother said sweetly, surely we can work something out. You wouldn't want to see your son homeless, would you? I nearly laughed at the irony. All those years I'd feared being alone, and now they were the ones begging for a roof. He's not homeless, I said evenly. He's an adult. He can rent like everyone else. There was silence on the other end, the kind that stretches until it snaps. You're cruel, she finally spat. You've lost your son forever. I smiled sadly. Maybe I already had. When the call ended, I realized something profound. I wasn't shaking anymore. The fear, the guilt, the ache of being unloved, they'd all loosened their grip. For the first time in decades, I felt steady. A week later, I drove past the house one last time. The moving truck was parked outside, boxes stacked high on the curb. Daniel was standing in the yard, his shoulders slumped. Sophie was on her phone, pacing angrily. I slowed the car, watching from a distance. Part of me wanted to stop, to comfort him, to say this didn't have to be the end. But I didn't. Some lessons can't be softened. As I turned the corner, a tear slid down my cheek, not of sadness, but of acceptance. Love isn't supposed to mean surrender. I had spent a lifetime giving, and now, for the first time, I had given enough. The media didn't take long to catch the scent. Someone, maybe one of Sophie's friends, had posted online about a heartless mother evicting her newlywed son. Within days, my inbox filled with messages from strangers. Some called me cruel, others called me brave. I read them all with quiet detachment. People always think they'd act differently, but they don't know the years that lead to a single breaking point. I didn't reply to anyone, didn't defend myself. I didn't need to. Truth doesn't require an audience. My story wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming what love had cost me. Daniel tried calling a few more times in the weeks that followed, but I didn't answer. I told myself I needed distance, that healing couldn't grow in the shadow of old wounds. I'd see his name flash across the screen and feel that familiar pull, the motherly instinct to fix everything, but I'd force myself to stay still. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone who's hurt you is let them face the mirror alone. Eventually, the calls stopped. The silence that followed wasn't painful anymore. It was peaceful. I spent my mornings gardening, my evenings reading. Slowly, the world began to feel like mine again. One afternoon, Weeks later, a letter arrived. The handwriting was shaky, uneven his. I hesitated before opening it. Inside, a single page. Mom, I'm sorry. I didn't realize how much I'd taken from you until it was gone. Sophie and I are moving to another city. I hope you're okay. Thank you for everything. Daniel. I sat there for a long time, the words blurring as tears filled my eyes. It wasn't much, but it was something, a fragment of the boy I'd once known. I didn't reply. Some apologies don't need answers. They just need to exist. I folded the letter neatly, tucked it in the back of an old photo album, and whispered, I forgive you. Life after that felt quieter, softer, like the calm after a storm that swept everything clean. I spent my days tending to the small things I'd long ignored, repainting the porch, baking on Sundays, calling old friends. Sometimes I'd catch myself smiling at nothing, just grateful to breathe without the weight of disappointment. I realized that motherhood doesn't end when a child betrays you. It simply changes shape. I still loved Daniel, but from afar, with boundaries made of self-respect instead of sacrifice. One evening, as the sun sank low, painting the sky in gold and rose, I whispered the truth that had taken me a lifetime to learn. Never let love blind you to disrespect, even from your own blood. Weeks turned into months, and life slowly found a rhythm that didn't include waiting for Daniel's calls. I still thought of him every morning. It's impossible to unlearn decades of motherly instinct, but now, instead of worrying whether he'd eaten or if his marriage was happy, I prayed that he was learning to stand on his own. The house I'd sold no longer haunted me. The money sat untouched in the bank, but its meaning had changed. It wasn't a symbol of revenge anymore, it was a monument to rediscovery. Sometimes I'd drive past the street where it stood and see the new family who'd moved in. A little girl often played on the porch, her laughter drifting across the yard like sunlight. I'd smile, thinking how life keeps moving, repurposing pain into someone else's joy. The neighbors had stopped whispering by then. They saw me walking, my dog, going to church again, even joining the library book club. You look younger these days, Margaret, one of them said once. I laughed, a real unguarded laugh, and replied, maybe it's because I finally started living for myself, and I meant it. Freedom has a strange weight at first. It feels like loss, but then it turns into air. One morning, I got a call from an unfamiliar number. The voice on the other end was gentle but uncertain. Mrs. Hale? She asked. This is Sophie. My stomach tightened. I hadn't expected to hear from her ever again. Daniel's in the hospital, she said, quietly. Nothing life-threatening, just exhaustion, stress. For a moment, old instincts flared, the urge to drop everything, to rush to his side. But I didn't move. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Her silence stretched. Because he keeps asking for you, she said finally. He says he needs to make things right. After we hung up, I sat by the window for a long time, watching the wind rustle through the trees. Part of me wanted to go, to hold his hand like I used to when he was small and scared. But another part whispered that maybe the best way to love him now was to let him face his choices. In the end, I wrote him a letter instead, short, honest, forgiving. I told him I was proud of him for realizing his mistakes, and that forgiveness wasn't a door he had to knock on, it was already open. Then I mailed it and prayed that it would reach the boy beneath the man he'd become. A few weeks later, a package arrived on my doorstep, small, neatly wrapped, no return address. Inside was a framed photograph, Daniel and me, taken years ago on his college graduation day. On the back, he'd written in his uneven handwriting, for everything you gave me, and for teaching me what love really means. I traced the edges of the photo, tears slipping silently down my cheeks. That image, frozen in time, reminded me of who we had once been, before pride, before betrayal, before the silence. I placed it on the mantel, beside an old vase of daisies, and whispered, "You're forgiven, my son." There was a lightness in my chest I hadn't felt in years. For so long, I'd believed strength meant holding on, but maybe true strength was knowing when to let go. That evening, as dusk settled over the town, I made myself a cup of tea and stepped out onto the porch. The air smelled of rain and earth, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone. I felt whole, patched together by forgiveness, not regret. I started volunteering at the community center soon after. Most of the volunteers were young, bright-eyed college students with dreams still shining like new pennies, but they welcomed me like I'd always been part of their circle. I taught them how to organize the kitchen, how to stretch $1 when feeding 50 hungry mouths, how to listen without judgment. One girl, barely 20, asked me one afternoon, "How do you stay so calm, even when life's unfair?" I smiled, stirring the pot of soup. "Because fairness is a luxury," I said softly. "Peace is something you make, not something you're given." They laughed, thinking it was just one of my old lady sayings, but I saw the spark in their eyes. Helping others gave me purpose again, not the desperate kind that used to define me as a mother, but a peaceful kind that asked for nothing in return. In their laughter, I heard echoes of Daniel's boyhood, and instead of pain, it brought warmth. Sometimes when the hall grew quiet at night, I'd look up at the ceiling and whisper, "Thank you, God, for giving me another chance not to start over, but to start right." The seasons changed. Winter came soft and slow, covering everything in a hush of white. I spent Christmas alone that year, but it wasn't lonely. I baked cookies, hung a wreath, and played the old carols Daniel used to love. The phone didn't ring, but my heart didn't ache for it anymore. Instead, I found joy in small things: the glow of the tree lights, the warmth of a blanket, the way snowflakes melted on the window pane like tiny miracles. I wrote one last letter to Daniel that night, not to send, just to keep. In it, I told him that I loved him, that he would always be my son, but that I'd finally learned love without pain was still love. As midnight neared, I sat by the fire, the world quiet except for the crackle of wood. And for the first time in 70 years, I felt free, not from my past, but from the need to rewrite it. Some endings aren't about closure. They're about peace. Spring came early that year, painting the trees in soft green and gold. I started tending to the little garden behind my house again, the one that had been neglected for years while I was too busy worrying about everyone else. The soil was stubborn at first, dry and cracked, but with a bit of care, it began to yield. I'd kneel there every morning, hands deep in the earth, feeling something inside me come alive again. One morning, as I pulled weeds from the flower bed, I found a tiny robin's nest tucked beneath the hydrangeas. Inside, 3 fragile eggs rested, trembling with the promise of life. I smiled, remembering the years I'd watched over my own nest, protecting it from every storm. But maybe I'd never realized that eventually, every bird must fly, and sometimes, they don't come back. That afternoon, I sat on the porch with my tea, watching the sun stretch across the yard, and it hit me: peace isn't a place you arrive at. It's something you choose, every single day. And I had finally chosen it. A few weeks later, I received a postcard from Daniel. The handwriting was steadier this time, more deliberate. The picture on the front showed a coastal town, cliffs, waves, and a lighthouse. On the back he wrote, "We're doing better, Mom. I got a new job. Sophie and I are trying to make things right. Thank you for everything, even the hard lessons. I understand now. Love, D." I traced the words with my fingertips, tears blurring my vision. I didn't need to write back. There was nothing more to say. The silence between us had transformed from a wound into a bridge. I placed the postcard on the mantel beside the graduation photo. 2 sides of the same story, beginnings and consequences. That night, I looked out at the moonlit garden and whispered, "I'm proud of you." Whether he heard me or not didn't matter. Forgiveness had stopped being something I gave to him. It had become something I gave to myself. Life settled into a rhythm I had never known before, one of gentle routine, unhurried mornings, and quiet evenings that didn't ache with loneliness. I began painting again, something I hadn't done since my 20s. My first canvas was simple, a house on a hill under a wide blue sky. Not our old house, not the one I'd sold, but something softer, imagined, filled with light. When I finished, I stepped back and realized I'd painted freedom. I hung it in the living room, right where the air caught the sunlight. Sometimes visitors would pause before it and ask, "Is that a real place?" I'd smile and say, "It is now." It became my way of reminding myself that new beginnings aren't born from revenge or regret, they grow from courage, the quiet kind that whispers, "You survived, now live." And so I did. I lived, and it was enough. Years later, when I turned 70, the community center threw me a small party. The room was filled with laughter, stories, and people I'd helped along the way. A young mother I'd mentored brought me a cake and said, "You're like a second mom to me." The words struck deep not in pain, but in gratitude. Maybe that was life's quiet justice. What I'd lost in one form had returned in another. I gave love, and it came back, not through blood, but through kindness. Near the end of the evening, someone asked if I had any regrets. I thought about Daniel, the wedding I never attended, the house I'd sold. Then I smiled. "No," I said, "because sometimes what feels like the end of love is just the beginning of self-respect." The room fell silent for a moment, then filled with applause. I wasn't sure if they understood the weight of what I meant, but I did, and that was enough. Now, as I sit by the window of my small home, the evening sun spilling across the floor, I think about how far I've come. I still keep that photo of Daniel and me by the fireplace, not as a reminder of pain, but of growth. Love, I've learned, isn't about sacrifice without boundary. It's about giving without losing yourself. For years, I believed motherhood meant enduring, no matter the cost. But the truth is, endurance without respect is just quiet heartbreak. The day I sold that house wasn't the day I punished my son, it was the day I reclaimed my life. I don't regret it. Not for a second. Because sometimes, to teach others how to love you, you have to show them what happens when they don't. As the last light fades and the world falls into gentle silence, I whisper the lesson my heart took 70 years to learn. Never let love blind you to disrespect, even from your own blood.